Hello, I'm ELD. Welcome to You Can Play Legacy, where we're talking about legacy decks on a modern budget or less. In this case, a very exciting build that just took down the ELD Legacy Open 27-player tournament. Let's take a look. I have Dragon by Rodney Hannigan. Here is a typed out list, and here is a visual spoiler of the entire list. Feel free to pause, but we are jumping right in to take a look at all of these cards. Up first, one of the best tutors in the game, Entomb, only one black. A lot of people don't think of this as a tutor, but it does search your library for any card you need and puts it into the graveyard, which is exactly where you want it. In this deck, you are bringing back very dangerous things from beyond the grave to end your opponent's run in a short order. I mean, this deck very often wins on the first turn, and we will show you how. Also, to get cards into the graveyard, we have Stitcher Supplier. When this dies, it puts the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard as well, so you get an ETB and a Dies trigger. And we have Cabal Therapy to potentially fuel that Dies trigger. So if you have Cabal Therapy in your hand, you can play it, play a Stitcher Supplier, flash it back, really go after their hand aggressively while milling 6 cards, hopefully putting something into the graveyard that's going to be worth bringing back. There's a ton of other discard in this deck as well, making sure that your opponent doesn't get up to anything too fun. Unmask can also target yourself if you have a creature in hand, as does Cabal Therapy. Be able to put those cards into the graveyard where they'll be of more use, of course, versus the best decks in the format. A lot of the time you're going to be targeting them and stopping them from potentially winning super early, which is what Grief does as well. The deck is extremely fast. We are running a playset of Dark Rituals and Lotus Petals. You're generally not keeping hands that aren't going to do something really busted on turn 1 unless it has just an absolute ton of discard and the matchup is actually favorable for that. There are some decks that don't actually care that much about you taking a few cards out of their hand, but there are some that really won't function if you hit them once or twice with a discard spell. So be careful, be selective with those opening hands, as this deck doesn't really have any type of draw engine. The goal is to get a creature into the graveyard and bring it back with Reanimate, Animate Dead, or Dance of the Dead. And Dance of the Dead and Animate Dead might look a little weird to some of you who are used to seeing Exhume in this deck, and the reason for that is while Gristlebrand is your #1 priority, as he lets you draw 14 cards a lot of the time, destroy your opponent's hand, he also lets you set up a kill in this deck. The other creatures are Worldgorger Dragon and Abdul. So these two creatures combined with Animate Dead or Dance of the Dead will actually go infinite. I'll go ahead and run through that loop for you. Basically, Animate Dead enters the battlefield, brings back Worldgorger or Abdul. From there, there's a triggered ability, which will exile any number of permanents with Abdul, or in the case of Worldgorger, all your other permanents. And those are going to essentially flicker in and out. As the Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, the creature will go back to the graveyard. When the creature goes back to the graveyard, that brings back the permanents, and it creates a loop. So with Worldgorger, you're getting infinite mana, infinite ETBs on things like Stitcher Supplier, and Abdul is getting not only infinite ETBs with Stitcher Supplier, but you're also getting a 1/1 each time. So if you just keep targeting the Animate, you'll just end up with a billion 1/1s, which against decks like Blue-Red Delver is actually enough. I mean, you can afford to pass the turn a lot of the time against those decks. However, if we do have a Stitcher Supplier, we can actually mill through the library, find Una, Queen of the Fae, and then actually win the game by using infinite mana to mill out our opponent on the spot, exiling their entire library. We get to see what they were up to in game 1. If it's post-board, we get to see their sideboard plan, so they're generally just going to scoop up in response to this. If they didn't, they'd be left with no library, and you'd have a whole ton of 1/1 blue and black very rogue creatures on the battlefield. A big selling point for this deck really is the budget. The mana base is entirely swamps, and that makes you so resilient versus Wasteland and by extension Daze, because once you don't have the ability to, once you don't have the detriment of losing a mana source here and there to a wasteland, for example, lists that ran Piranha Marsh, they could get set back, which then puts Daze online, making swamp after swamp versus Delver when you just shred their hand with each turn over those first couple of turns can be absolutely brutal. They can't really kill you in 1 or 2 turns, so if you can just absolutely destroy their hand and then just make infinite guys, you are almost definitely going to win. And of course, there are actual just straight up kills, as we talked about with Una and World Gorger, but just passing the turn with Abdul is often going to be enough. The main deck is pretty solid. We have seen Rodney actually win with Shriekhorn instead of Stitcher Supplier. I suspect Stitcher Supplier will end up being the better card. It just plays better with Cabal Therapy. It's also black to pitch to both Unmask and Grief. And it's also a creature which you can bring back with your Animate effect. So I think overall that's probably going to end up being the right choice. The sideboard's very much up in the air. I don't really love his sideboard for this event, but he did win this 27-person event. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what he was running. He had additional Thoughtseize, so that's just an absolute ton of discard. You've got access to Thoughtseize, Unmask, Grief, and Cabal Therapy. I mean, if your opponent's only starting with 7 cards, that seems like it might be overkill. But he's got it in there, and he did win, so maybe you can go on the World Gorger Discord and see what Rodney's thoughts are about this sideboard. Fairy Macabre, a really solid piece of removal for the graveyard, doesn't get stopped by things like Chancellor of the Annex, isn't a spell, so it's not getting countered by the free counter spells that are available in the format. It's just available online from the get-go, and it is a creature. And it's just generally solid for messing with your opponent's graveyard. You can also, of note, use this if your opponent tries a surgical extraction targeting your creatures. You can actually Fairy Macabre and get rid of one of them just for the ability to kind of counter that surgical. You'll lose the 1 card from the graveyard, but they won't get to search as it'll be counted on resolution. He also had access to Engineered Explosives, another card that does raise eyebrows. It is a mono black deck. Granted, you do have Lotus Petals, so you can potentially get a bit more Sunburst out of this, but it is probably not the best sideboard option. Again, you can't always argue with results. I haven't tested Engineered Explosives in a mono black deck, but I am suspicious of it. In the past, people have run things like Ratchet Bomb or Powder Keg. Feed the Swarm, on the other hand, seems very solid, destroying a creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and you lose life equal to its mana value. This was an incredible printing. I mean, a color pie shattering printing, giving black the ability to target and destroy enchantments at the cost of life, which is really, I mean, black has been very comfortable paying life to do things since the beginning of the game, but it hasn't been able to handle enchantments. So this is really an incredible printing from the last couple of years. And then Rodney's sideboard kind of switch for this deck for this tournament was Rotting Regisaur, the 7/6/4/3. Very often you can Dark Ritual this out like on the first turn and just run away with the game. It does allow you to discard cards, so you can potentially fuel your graveyard as you're going with this for your main plan. If they do answer it, you may be able to eventually go ahead and bring something back from the graveyard. But this was his list. It is a budget deck. I hope you enjoy it, and it is definitely worth putting this together. There are a couple of choices here and there that you might change, but that's part of the fun of the format, kind of making something your own, finding a way to win with it, even on a budget. Just remember, you can play Legacy.